So welcome back to a Legacy of Purpose podcast. Today, I'm super excited to welcome Dr. Alaa Murabit, a physician, a global advocate, a visionary leader, someone I like to call a close friend. But her journey from founding the Voices of Libyan Women to shaping international policy at the United Nations, and most recently, the Gates Foundation has redefined what radical resilience and leadership mean in our world today. Perhaps what's most important to me is that I get to spend the next hour with a dear friend who I was just saying I'm extremely proud of. I deeply admire and respect all the work that you've done over the past years. It's just incredible. I met you, I think it must have been maybe 11 or 12 years ago, and what you have accomplished in that time, in just that short time, is nothing short of astounding. And you've made such an incredible impact on the world. And your impact spans health, women's rights, climate resilience, the voice for women and religion. I can go on, but I love the way everything you do is done with courage, with collaboration, and extreme compassion for those who are not always served in our society. So I want to thank you for everything that you do, and I want to welcome you again to our podcast. And I hope that everybody listening finds this conversation as inspiring as I'm sure it's going to be. So thank you, Alaa, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I noticed you very purposefully admitted that the first time we ever met, you had been one of the judges for the Ashoka Fellowship. And I still remember this. I was 22 years old. I was trying so hard to impress you, and you were interviewing me, and I'm pretty sure I started crying within the first 5 minutes. And I was trying to be women and peace and security. And then you were tell me what inspires you to do this. Tell me about your parents. And I was oh my goodness, we're
going there. We're going there.
Deep.
We got deep really fast.
But
speaking about your family, incredible family that it is. You were born into a family with an additional 10 siblings. You were born in Canada, and you moved to Libya at an extremely difficult time, and you entered medical school in Libya at the very young age of 15. I did not know that about you. No, I didn't know that you were that young when you went into medical school. And since then, you've been on this journey to make the world a better place. So I have a couple questions that I want to ask you about your background. The obvious one: how did your upbringing with 10 siblings as Libyans in a small town in Canada, how did that impact your journey and where you are today?
It's an excellent question. I mean, I love that you called them the additional 10. I'm the
because you're a powerhouse. I haven't met all the other 10.
They would so fundamentally disagree, and they would be right too. Mashallah, they're all equally incredible.
I can imagine they're all incredible.
But I love that I get to be the subject here. No, I was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and at the time I was born in the late 80s. At the time, it was quite homogeneous. It's definitely grown since then, but it was quite homogeneous, and we were kind of very clearly one of the larger families, and particularly larger immigrant families. Yeah. My parents had come in the early 80s from Libya to Canada. And I have 5 older brothers and sisters and 5 younger, so I'm the perfect middle. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. I never actually appreciated, I think, having so many siblings until I got older. When you're younger, you're so different. It's frustrating. And I think very naturally, as I've gotten older, I've appreciated that so many of the things that fill my cup, be it, somebody I can turn to for advice, somebody who will kind of really put me in my place when I need to be put in my place.
Always going to be your siblings.
Always going to, and you have them. You don't even have to go looking for it. So it was interesting. It meant that I had kind of this already well-cultivated cultivated tribe. And it was incredibly helpful and challenging because, sometimes you do want to do something and go rogue, and your siblings kind of hold you accountable really quickly. I think the benefit of that many siblings is very quickly you learn you can be multiple things, and people have different talents that can be very useful. So I was just talking about my younger brother, Abdu. He's my mom's favorite.
Is he the youngest?
Youngest boy. And all the youngest kids. My mom has many favorites. That's a first.
Well, I mean, she has
so many kids, but the youngest ones hold a special place in her heart because, after 11 kids, they're leaving. So the youngest boy and youngest girl hold a special place, as do the oldest. And I knew growing up, if there was something in particular I wanted, I could go to my oldest sister or my youngest brother. You could build alliances. You could negotiate.
Yeah, of course.
You could kind of trade, like, okay, you ask dad for this, and I'll ask mom for this, and so. That's
where you learned your incredible negotiation skills.
I learned everything I know from my siblings, truly. And everything since then, from my family, I would say, I've learned everything I know. And since then, it has been validated to me, or it has been, I have additional evidence from professional experience. But I learned everything I know from my siblings when it comes to negotiation or alliance building or compromise, which I'm not very good at and they will agree with, but I learned everything I know from my family.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I love siblings too. They're wonderful. I'm also lucky. I want to talk to you a little bit about Libya and what it means to be Libyan, right? I've spent a lot of time with you. I spent time with your husband. You're both Libyan. You're raising children. You're bringing the Libyan parts of you into that. You went to Libya at a very young age. You were 15. And, Libya has been going through some tough times, right? What was it like to go to medical school at the age of 15 in Libya as someone who had been raised in Canada up until that point? What was it that happened in Libya that pushed you to say, I need to shake up healthcare systems?
Well, it wasn't. So it's interesting. I knew I wanted to be a doctor at a really young age because my dad was a physician assistant, a surgical assistant. My sister went into medical school quite young. So I always knew, and when they take you to take your kids to work day and you're supposed to observe from far away, I was the kid who would come so close that they would have to get new scrubs on, new equipment on. So I knew I wanted to be a physician. I particularly thought I wanted to be a surgeon. And so when I finished high school early in Canada, there were only a few options. I would have to, because of my age, even with doing a 4-year bachelor's degree, I probably still wouldn't get in until I was a little older because there were more mature students and you go through a process. So I was thinking, well, do I spend the next 4 to 8 years getting degrees until I can go into the path I want? Or do I just go into the path I want elsewhere? And my mom had moved to Libya 3 years earlier. So I was like, okay, well, that's where I'll go. And I had loved going to Libya as a kid. I mean, you go when you're 7 and 8, it's beaches and ice cream.
Of course. Great beaches.
Great beaches and delicious ice cream. And everyone's so excited to see you, especially because they know you're leaving in 3 weeks. And when you move there at 15 as a young lady, I think it's slightly different because you inherit the reality of living there. And what that means. And it's challenging because you don't actually know the rules really. So, for me, the very first year was pre-med, and it was kind of within medical school there. The first year is Zadadi, so kind of your preliminary medical year. And it was all in Arabic. And I did not know how to read and write Arabic well enough to be doing tests in it. So I still remember at the time, this is back in 2005, I would scan the sheets. I would send them to my dad, who was still in Canada. He would help me translate them, and then he would email them back to me.
Oh, God.
It was such a process. This is before WhatsApp and all of the easier ways to communicate. And so it was genuinely it wasn't just me. It was more of like a family effort because I needed to be able to learn and do this. And so I don't identify medical school or moving to Libya as significantly challenging. I think I identify it as feeling accountable. Like I felt accountable to do well because I had made the decision. I knew I wanted medicine, and I now was in a position where I needed assistance because I couldn't speak the language well enough. Yeah. When I got into first year, it was all in English. And at that point, it was kind of my show to run. Yeah. But that first year was a challenging one. And then learning the norms and deciding for most of it that I didn't actually want to engage with them. And my parents didn't move to the capital. A lot of people, when they move back to their home country, will move to the capital. They'll put their kids all in English schools. And we moved to Zawiya, which is 30 minutes away, but it's a much smaller city that my dad is originally from, and much more insular. And so you also had kind of that reality, which I Canada is not known for those kind of family or tribal affiliations in the same way, where it ends up being incredibly important. So I will say I never thought of shaking up health systems. I thought I would be a physician, a surgeon, and that was my intent and purpose up until, I would say, close to when the revolution broke out. And that was really when it felt like, okay, I'm seeing all of these people, particularly women, and it was particularly women for me, who were the backbone of the revolution, who were making sure medicine got to the front line, who were smuggling things out of pharmacies, who were cleaning clothes, who were delivering food, who were traveling with gasoline, which was, despite being a very oil-rich country, was actually one
scarce
of the most,
at the time.
very scarce. And so all of, and really putting themselves at risk. And yet once the conversation started pivoting to becoming a political conversation where power was really on the table, women were entirely excluded.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it wasn't necessarily health systems. It was more, how do you create inclusive systems that reflect the people that build them? Not the people that just get to contribute from them or kind of benefit from them, but the people that actually contribute to them. And oftentimes that's women, and they weren't at the table. So that became kind of the mission.
And then you founded Voices of Libyan Women, right, as the Libyan revolution was ending.
Was beginning.
Or you did it at the beginning of it.
We did it at the beginning. Yeah, so we did it at the beginning, and then at the end. So Voice of Libyan Women was founded in March of 2011. So the month after it broke out.
So it was
right after. And Zawiya was the first country in the West to rise up. So it was at that point Benghazi had first city in the West to rise up and was quickly retaken by government forces. But it was right when the revolution started. And then following that, in November of 2011, that was when we did the One Voice conference, which was kind of a really big bringing together all of these advocates and activists, professionals from different, technical leaders, and with the new political parties and the emerging transition government to say, okay, how do we actually ensure that this doesn't get put to the wayside and this is part of policy? But we started from the onset, and actually by July, August had done the Women's Charter, where we had traveled to many other cities to be able to collect some of their kind of input that they would want reflected in the Constitution. And that went into the next year because as cities became accessible, we went there.
So in 2014, that is actually when you and I met, because that's when you were nominated as an Ashoka Fellow, and I was on your judging panel, and that was in Egypt. And at the time I was still in Egypt. And of course, we had a very moving conversation about the story of why you created that organization. I know there was one particular story that impacted you deeply, but there was an insight that you shared that Donovan and I found really interesting. You said, outrage is mobilizing, but hope is sustaining. Mm-hmm. And that is the piece we're often missing. People are outraged, they march, they mobilize, and they engage. To sustain that, we need the hope that is a system that can be changed. Mm-hmm. And, I remember even when I interviewed you for the Ashoka Fellowship, I was completely taken back by the incredible wisdom that you had, even at that very young age. What was like the exact moment that really pushed you to take action and to mobilize on behalf of women in Libya?
I think initially I was mobilized by rage. Yeah. I think that's why rage is so powerful.
Yeah.
Anger is an incredibly powerful instigator. I saw some of my own friends deeply impacted. The story I had told you was actually about the loss of a good friend of mine. And so for me it was, and it wasn't unilateral. There was a community of women. I had classmates in medical school. We were in our 5th year of medical school who were uncomfortable going to the hospital, but still had to, because we were told that if we didn't show up, our malafs, our files would be thrown out. And so for me, it wasn't unilateral. It was a recognition that if we didn't do something, I felt like we would be in a worse spot than we were before. And at that point, I still remember we had been sitting down and we had been drafting what would become, VLW, the Voice of Libyan Women. It was like this 3-page essay. And we had put into Google at the time, like, how do you make sure women get rights? And they gave us all these UN frameworks, and there was all of this, and it was like, okay, but in conflict. And I still remember there was one of the articles had said, actually, conflict is a window of opportunity because you can kind of create new norms. Everything shifts in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, if we don't take advantage of this, we're never going to get to take advantage of it. And I do think I credit a lot actually to being younger and more naive because I had never engaged in political organization.
Yeah, you hadn't become cynical yet.
Yeah, well, but I had never studied it. I never knew it. My assumption was similar to in medicine, like if you have data and people see the data, people will act based on data. Like it was very much the science of activism or advocacy, and I did not understand yet at that point deeply enough yet power dynamics and why even with the best of evidence you will not be able to garner political will and why there is so much resistance. None of that. I was like, no, we just need to show proof and people will change. Policies will change. You show women's agency means that you have more economic opportunity and growth and things will improve. And that to me was the kind of the spark. And then I think what helped was there's a resolution called 1325, which is Women, Peace, and Security, and it has flaws, and a lot of people will argue with its implementation. And frankly, there's a lot of things that the UN could do better. But what it does provide is it allows for you, if your country has signed on to it, to take it to leadership and say, hey, you've actually said you support this, and yet you're not. And so that became one of the tools I used to be able to say, okay, and it's anchored on women's inclusion in conflict, women, peace, and security. So how do you ensure that women have leadership roles? How do you engage women in a political and transitional process? How do you also recognize their unique vulnerabilities? So that became the sustaining part because the outrage was this couldn't happen and should not happen to us. I didn't have a picture of what good looked like. And so that framework was like, oh, okay, I can ask for these things.
Right.
And if I can get closer to those things, at least we're on a pathway of progress, right? And that's what got me kind of much more involved in the movement. And that's, I think, one of the things that really made me choose, for lack of a better word, whether it would be, the day-to-day practice of medicine or the day-to-day work of kind of advocacy
being an advocate
and systems change and things like that.
Yeah. Well, by the age of 25, you had successfully negotiated and passed a number of resolutions through the United Nations Security Council. And you actually became appointed as the UN High-Level Commissioner on Health, Employment, and Economic Growth. And I remember reading that announcement, and I was like, wow, that was such a short time between, when you became an Ashoka Fellow, and then when you became appointed as the UN High-Level Commissioner. And it's such a big jump. And I was so impressed because I remember also I was nominated and chosen to be a UN SDG pioneer. And I remember seeing you at the UN thinking how far you've come in such a short time. So what led, you went from medical school to starting this organization to advocacy at the highest levels of the UN. And in many conversations, you talk about the need not just for Band-Aid solutions, but for real systemic change, which you just mentioned. Systemic change that would allow for women's equity, climate resilience, policy reform. This is MIT, and we talk about systems change all the time, and we teach classes on systems dynamics. And here at the center, we have an actual scholar in residence who specializes in systems change entrepreneurship. People define it differently. What does all of that mean to you in terms of systems change when you are talking to all of these high-level people at the UN, who many people perceive to be a relatively ineffective organization?
Oh, yeah. So I think the interesting thing there is the kind of pathway to, so not necessarily the jump. So with VLW, and I anchor it on everything on the Noor campaign, frankly. At one point, I had been we were doing these workshops on women's economic empowerment and agency. We were doing workshops with the Ministry of Labor. We were doing stuff on women's health and health access. We were doing women, peace, and security. And yet I started noticing we had the same people coming from the same families who I think were already bought into what I was saying.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like, how do we actually get people who disagree with us to show up?
Yeah.
And so I started asking, and people would say like, oh, it's great for you. Even like extended family members would be like, the work you're doing is wonderful for you, but not for my daughter. And it increasingly became a conversation that was anchored in the perception that what I was saying was opposed to Islamic teachings. And that was what I think for me is systems change, or kind of the anchoring of all of the work after, which was at that time, a lot of the kind of global donors and European and Western organizations were like, we don't want to talk about religion. Why are you talking about religion? And a lot of the local organizations were like, no, don't do this. This only empowers, misused and manipulated rhetoric. And I found that such an interesting case, because I think in order for you to truly transform systems, you actually have to be able to negotiate power.
Yep.
And I didn't have that as a young women's rights organization. So what we did do was we actually worked with the Ministry of Religion, and we said, listen, we need your logo on these billboards so people understand that we're not, cherry picking text. And they were like, okay, those are actual Islamic texts. You can find them in the Holy Book, the Quran. Those are hadiths or sayings of the Prophet. And then being able to leverage those. And what we did was, because of the kind of geographic organization of Libya, it's similar to if somebody from New York went down to like Texas and started talking about values and norms. There's a huge amount of power in somebody local to you, who you trust. And so we created a very kind of federalized system of advocacy where every city created its own city team. They gave it a name. So Benghazi's was El Manara, which means the lighthouse, because that was a well-known symbol to them. And everybody had their own name. These teams across the country would then go and do advocacy in their local communities. And it was made up of their teachers, of former representatives, of men and women, and would go to school.
You created
places.
a movement.
And honestly, the campaign was excellent in that it wasn't just information, but then we did surveys to get data, because data is hard to get. Legitimate data, especially in conflict, is really challenging to get, and you operate often on assumption. And so from the Noor campaign, that ended up being really pivotal, because numerous other countries and organizations replicated the methodology. And we used that methodology throughout some of our consultations on women, peace, and security. So my first real introduction to the UN was actually as a global advisor for the 15th anniversary of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. And that was how I first got involved. And it was those resolutions that I could influence and engage on because of that lived experience. Yeah. And then from there, I got involved with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or what would become them, really influencing the peace and justice and strong institutions work. And the commissioner really came from a lot of conversations around, if we really want to talk about health and health access, we do actually need to talk about the gender dynamic of it, both in terms of gendered implications for health, but also access, opportunity, especially as it relates to economic growth. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the pathway. And I do think it all started with a conversation where the assumption wasn't that people who disagreed with me were wrong, but an assumption that I needed to be able to phrase the language. And I do think for systems change, we need to be able to illustrate a world where everybody can see themselves and everybody can see that their values have merit. And that you can then negotiate them in good faith, rather than come in and say, this is everything you're doing is inaccurate. This is all right. I don't think gets us as far. So that's probably, it might sound to some I know, as maybe some in the UN system, maybe more revolutionary, to some more incremental, depending on where you sit on that spectrum. But I think systems inherently want to hold on to their framework and being able to both shift pieces and build on pieces, I think can actually be very helpful.
I love this, because essentially you're saying that if you really want to create change, everyone has to be included. And that means that you really need to meet people where they are and create space to have their views also be heard and seen, and then find ways to get closer together.
100%. I mean, I think it's less about women-led or it's more about inclusive processes, right?
We're so not there, Alaa, in this world that we're living in.
Well, of course we're not. But if you look at, so I'll tell you, years ago, this was when I first started, someone who was in my extended family, wasn't necessarily very close to. I had been talking about our work in Libya, and he was like super resistant. He was like, "This makes no sense. I don't know what you're talking about." And I would explain. I'd be like, "No, but listen." And finally, like he kind of stopped and said, "Alaa," and he's an elder. Said, "Alaa, everything you say means that everything I raised my daughters, everything I taught them to believe, all the values that I was raised with by my own family are all wrong. And you're right." And it was the first time somebody had said that to me, of like, if you come in here just telling me this is how things should be, you're implying that everything before you was completely inadequate or inaccurate. And at some times when we talk about it, intentionally so.
Yeah.
And I don't think that breeds well for change. I actually think people need to feel like, okay, you see me where I am, I see you where you are. We're both not going to get everything we want.
But we can come a little closer.
We can come a little closer, and it'll be more sustainable. And over time, people build, inshallah. Every generation will build on that. But I think otherwise we see what we're seeing now, which is, we've social change movements happen, and they're not necessarily resilient. Almost immediately, you're going to see backlash, and the backlash will be more severe than the initial challenge.
Absolutely, because we all resist change.
And so, and that's a very human thing. So I think everybody needs to be able to see themselves, and there needs to be space for everybody at that table.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your TED Talk that you gave in 2015, and it was titled, "What Islam Really Says About Women." And that TED Talk was viewed by millions, myself included. And in that talk, you spoke about the important need for women to be at the table, to challenge narratives that are wrong, and to really take on outdated systems at their very core. And I think you've definitely been, walking that talk and sitting at the tables. But I'm wondering, if you think back to the time of that talk, did you anticipate the massive impact that talk would not just have on your career, but on many other women who saw that talk?
I did not. I think, I don't know if I've told you this story, but I had been in Libya, so I had done the Oslo Freedom Forum literally 2 days before I flew in for the TED Talk. And it was so unexpectedly overwhelming for me that I called my mom and I said, "Can you please come?" Because I was like, "Oh, I did not realize it was this big." Yeah, and there were this many people, and so my dad stayed on my mom flew down. My dad stayed on the phone with me as I practiced my speech, because I also didn't realize you needed to memorize it, and I'm not a very good memorizer of speeches. So it was overwhelming. I think the thing I would have, the TED Talk talks about not just women's inclusion, but I have a pretty firm belief. I'm a very proud Muslim. I believe in the power of individual faith immensely, because I think it's one of my greatest, drivers, and one of the ways in which I find strength. But I also think religion as an organized construct has been one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, function in our world, and has created so many. I mean, if you look at our legal process, if you look at law, economics.
You have to tell me I'm Egyptian.
Exactly. Literally, exactly.
We are also...
No, but everything anchors from faith, from this organized religion. And I do think my major kind of focus of it was that we do need to start divorcing religion as an organized tool from faith, because I do think that the manipulation and misuse of religion across all major faiths, and the unilateral interpretation of religion by predominantly men, has meant that it is absent of
very dangerous.
Yeah, it's incredibly dangerous, particularly for women. It's absent of women's experiences, absent of their lens. And had I known how many people would have viewed that, I think I would have put more time into explaining that distinction. Because it was hard for a lot of people to be like, "Oh, but you're clearly Muslim, and yet you're saying organized religion is ineffective." And I don't know if that, and so if I could go back, I would probably add a sentence or two saying your individual faith, that personal spiritual calibration, whatever you need, that is not the same thing as organized religion. You may associate them together. You may, go to your local congregation, mosque, synagogue, temple, whatever it might be, and find a lot of community in organized religion. But the construct of organized religion can be an incredibly powerful positive or negative tool.
Absolutely.
And history has shown us for women more often negative.
Negative. And I'm also a very proud Muslim, and my faith means a lot to me. And I, when you're in America, you often get faced with this lens of Muslim women are oppressed, and you kind of look and say, I'm standing here right in front of you. Do I look? I'm not oppressed. I mean, there are these big stereotypes around what it means to be a Muslim woman. And when we go back to the very origins of our religion and the first wife of Prophet Muhammad, Khadija, and people forget the story, and I love the story, and I say it all the time. Khadija was the most successful entrepreneur in all of Arabia. She was 40 years old. She chose the Prophet, who wasn't the Prophet at the time, to work for her in her business. She proposed to him. Yeah. She was divorced. She was a woman with agency. Yeah. And she used that agency, and she made her own decisions.
Yeah. And she financed the Islamic Ummah in its infancy.
Exactly, in its infancy. And somehow I feel that we don't tell that narrative also enough, so that women, not just are women of from where we come from or Muslim women at large, but also so that Western media can stop only sharing that one narrative, right? That single story narrative becomes very dangerous.
Well, and so it's such an interesting point to me, because Khadija radiallahu anha was like this kind of economic powerhouse. Yeah. And then you had most of the sayings of the Prophet were transmitted by one of his wives, Aisha. And you had Hafsa radiallahu anha, who really kind of safeguarded the Quran, the holy book. You had Nusayba, who was, kind of protected him in combat and in war.
Yes, right. I forgot about Nusayba. There's so many amazing women.
Incredible stories. And yet and that to me is actually the most kind of reaffirming piece. If I didn't have that historical leg to stand on, then I would actually be able to say, okay, wait a second, I don't see women represented very well. But then it stops, right? And that's when the interpretation piece comes in. And that's when you notice that, wait, this is a faith, this religious institution becomes an organizing construct.
Or the organized institution of it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where you see women, and that's no different than
any other.
And by
the way, same happened in Christianity. The same happened in every major faith.
But in every major industry as well.
Absolutely.
Once it became lucrative, once it becomes, and even today for community health workers, oftentimes community health workers around the world are either unpaid or very lowly paid. And yet when you start increasing their salaries, and because of that, they're 70 to 80% women, when you start increasing the salaries and there's an actual paycheck to the job, they start being taken over actually by men in the community. So it's not unique to just faith. There is a piece of it where it is fundamentally about power, and faith is a very good tool to maintain and own power. But the other piece of it is, I spent a long time trying to make people understand the answer to the role of Muslim women, and I realized now, I have a 4-year-old daughter, who is brilliant and incredible, and I would hate if she grows up feeling like she has to articulate to people how she's not oppressed, or if she feels like that's even a question she has to humor. And so I've stopped, that's not my audience. Yeah. I mean, if that's, and I don't think it's a
distraction.
It's a distraction. It's not even a good faith question. If you're coming at me with that after kind of everything else, and it was an old mentor of mine told me when I was, 22, he said, Ada, you're going to have 4 things that always work against you. You're going to be, you're visibly Muslim, you are a woman, you're clearly Arab, and you're young. And he said, the benefit is that one you'll grow out of. And
all too soon.
Truly. But it was interesting to me, because I see it as the exact opposite. I mean, those 4 things are huge strengths. I come into a room with a completely different perspective than anybody else. I come in with a completely different community and constituency. I'm then accountable to bring in perspectives and to ensure other people can come in as well. But I'm so shaped by those experiences that I think it's a huge benefit. Mm-hmm. And I think we're slowly seeing a world that recognizes people's different perspectives and experiences as a benefit. And anybody who holds on to kind of an archaic, superficial assumption of people based on something they didn't even take the time to read or learn or engage in. I don't know if that's something I'm interested. That's not something I'm interested in engaging in anymore.
Fair. Very fair. So, I want to say that you're always telling me, Dina, you need to speak more. You need to engage in public speaking more. You need to share your thoughts more. And I'm always saying, Alaa, I'm the introvert. I don't really like public speaking. And you're always saying you need to do it. But it's not always easy for women to own their space. And I want to ask, because I know that this is something that you encourage women to do, but I want to know, what advice do you have for women, specifically women entrepreneurs, who come from growth markets, which the countries that we serve as the Center for Development Entrepreneurship. What advice do you have for women when it comes to owning their space and finding their voice and using it?
What advice do I have?
I just want to tell everybody, she does not shy away from using her voice.
Well, no, and the reason I think you should more is because, alhamdulillah, for the past 10, 12 years, I've gotten the benefit of your guidance and advice, and I actually think it's completely changed the way I look at
maybe
the world.
One-on-one.
No, I know, but you should bestow it upon more people. And I think actually my biggest piece of advice is to just do it, probably. I mean, nobody is inherently comfortable with engaging. And a lot of it, I mean, there's some things I said years ago where I'm like, oh my gosh, did I actually say that in an interview? Oh, and if only you had the benefit of what you know now. Or
it made sense at the time. This is what I always say to myself. In the moment, it was the right thing to say.
It's what you know what you know, right? And so, but I do think part of it is so many of the women who I respect and admire. I mean, like, just aside from you, Fariza Farhan, Jahad Dakouri, Roy Mahboub, there's these amazing women who have such a depth and breadth of experience and knowledge and feel really not hesitant, but question the power of their voice a lot. And I actually don't think everyone does that. I think we do. We assume like, okay, wait, am I the person who should speak up about this? Will I reflect everyone's perspectives? No, we don't. You won't. And nobody holds, and I'm not picking on James's here, but nobody holds a guy named James to that account. He's not supposed to represent every single woman from the global South always, or every single man from the global North. That's not. We're the ones who are supposed to come in and represent a community behind us at all times. And so my one piece of advice would be, no, you show up with your experience, with your expertise, and represent yourself and your constituency to the best of your ability, but at least show up, because the alternative is that those conversations happen without you. And then that perspective is never heard.
Yeah. Somebody very close to me recently said, when you choose not to speak, you're depriving the group from the value that you bring.
100%. Yeah. And you can't complain then about any of the outcomes, right? So like, if you chose not to speak up and the solution is not one that reflects lived experience, or you don't think will actually be able to be implemented because it's not realistic, then you don't actually get to say anything, because you abdicated that responsibility, right? Yeah. So I think you're accountable for it when you're in any space. And I also do think, particularly, and I will say for women from our community, from our region, the assumption is that we don't. And so part of me feels like it's even more important, a responsibility, because then if my daughter can't see women like her speaking up, I don't think she'll feel as comfortable. So I think it's something we, in the same way every generation before us has done it for us.
I worry sometimes that we put the burden on women like you to carry that for us, and I don't think that's right. We should be right up there.
I think we all should. No, I think we all should. And I think that's where we build something greater than a single story. If it's just 1 or 2 or 10 or 15, that's the challenge, right? Yeah. Because that's the only perspective that an audience is getting. But imagine if it's 100, 200, 10,000.
And get all those out there.
You know what I mean? And then people can see the diversity of experience, of perspective. I mean, you and I don't agree on 95%. Well, probably that's not.
I don't know about that.
I don't know about that. But we don't agree on a lot. And yet, if nobody hears your perspective.
We agree on a lot more than what we disagree. But I hear you.
Then they assume my perspective reflects a group, which is not always the case.
Which is not always the case. So you spoke a little bit about the importance of economic inclusion of women, and I want to zoom in a little bit on that because since this is the Center for Development Entrepreneurship, we know that the data is there. The World Bank has numerous times in multiple studies talked about how gender equity in the formal labor market can lead to massive increases in GDP growth. It seems pretty simple. When you talk to like a Libya or in Egypt or in Nigeria or Brazil or in Indonesia or wherever, it seems pretty simple. Create gender equality, you're going to see massive impact on your economic prosperity journey. But yet we're not seeing it. We're just not seeing the numbers. And, I think women-led ventures can be a big part of boosting prosperity. And women in senior executive positions and women as policymakers. Women's leadership, you say this all the time, it's not a nice to have. Mm-hmm. It's an absolute essential. But the numbers are just not there. So my question to you is, what do we need? And I know you believe in the power of narratives and stories. I mean, because I want to say that from so many angles, so many of us have worked on the importance of economic inclusion of women, and we talk about what policies need to be in place, and we talk about boards and governance and putting women on boards, and then the World Bank or the IFC creates some special certification for women to sit on boards that I think is a little condescending, but anyway, let's move on from that. You know what I mean? What do we need to do to really shift mindsets and to create that space that would allow for gender equality in the formal labor market, because women carry the brunt in the informal sector.
And I think that's actually part of it. I think it's recognizing all the work that they do informally and actually compensating for it would be one piece of it. But beyond that, I actually don't think women's inclusion in the formal economy is solely an economic problem or a gendered problem. I actually think it's, and we've been talking a lot about this at work, but there's this kind of this notion in many of these developed countries where you're seeing aging populations, and an assumption that in frontier and emerging markets that would be able to help compensate for it because you have all this younger population. And when they actually looked at it, they were like, wait a second, we're not seeing the economies we thought we would, because it's not an age demographic challenge, it's a gendered one. It's a gendered one. So we're still having that kind of economic gap, right? And I think it's multifold. I think it starts from the very beginning. I mean, if we talk about everything from girls' education to, and secondary education in particular, the ability to actually be able to enter the formal workspace, the informal networks, relationships, access to financing that you need. All of those are pieces that we actually do have to be able to deliver on. But I think the deepest one is we often talk about the absence of, not the benefit of. And I think that's what I'm seeing shift, which is exciting. And when you talk about the power of narratives, I think it is the benefit of women-led resilience, or the benefit of women's engagement in the economic market. It's what do they
use
actually...
our entrepreneurial language.
Exactly.
Move from scarcity to abundance.
Exactly. No, but 100%, because that's what it is, right? What we're saying, we're not saying that this is somehow going to completely, and it will. Let's not deny. It will shift norms in workplaces, communities. It'll shift health outcomes. It'll shift education outcomes. All that's true. But what we're saying first and foremost is that it will actually create the opportunity for greater economic growth for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think starting from that as a spot can be helpful. The other piece I'd say is there's a lot of these niche, like women fund, like women, to your point, something that'll come out of the World Bank that's quite niche, or we'll talk about like women's economic empowerment as a separate. And I think something that's super interesting is the sheer amount of funds and resources that are put into something like, for example, climate. Have we ever looked at that and said we're going to earmark to make sure that a percentage of this goes to women-led ventures? Or we're going to, because that I think is the piece that's kind of missing, is we have all of these massive existing institutions, policies, and norms. Can we actually say we're going to, as part of the total amount, require that this is this is leading to more of an inclusive growth, that we're actually taking that into consideration when we make decisions. So it's not a niche $50 million fund, but it's that broader, $16 billion that the World Bank is programming for climate writ large. So I think pieces like that. One thing I will say the Women, Peace and Security movement did quite well, although I don't think it's implemented well enough at all, is create things like national action plans. Like, what does good look like? And very few countries have implemented them effectively.
I was going to say the plans get done, and then what?
But for women's engagement in the formal work, like formal market space, I think the challenge isn't just the plans. It's okay, if you can actually tell me what are the big bets, what are the best buys? What do I actually need to invest in within that value chain? Because it's not, I need to go and invest in 50 women entrepreneurs. That's not going to solve the problem. So what is the marriage of solutions within that plan that I need to actually take into consideration?
Including the structural issues.
Exactly, because that's where I think you can actually, but right now it does feel, and this is true across health, this is true across climate, this is true across everything, it does feel like we do things in a very kind of siloed, piecemeal way. And how can we actually integrate them? Because if you do get more women who have agency over their own resources, who can spend them how they choose, you're going to have women who are choosing to space out their kids more, get married later. You're going to have much more effective health interventions and outcomes. It actually does create a domino effect for the entire community. It's not simply about that economic opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so how do you actually paint a picture that shows that investments in health could actually be complementary to some of the investments you're making for women's entrepreneurship, right. Could be reinforced.
And it's all interconnected.
Yeah, it could be reinforced by climate funding and other things to show that you can actually build resilience in a more holistic way.
So let's talk about women's health a little bit. So you spent the past several years working at the Gates Foundation, and I often come to you and I said, I heard you say this about women in health, and I heard you say it, and I was blown away. And I'm like, thank you so much for saying. I say that to you all the time. But women's health is such a significant issue right now. And I think even though we're seeing this kind of rise in what we call femtech, and we're seeing more entrepreneurs take on issues related to women's health, we're not seeing enough of it. And we're certainly not seeing enough capital be allocated specifically to this space. And, I want to say that women's health is not an issue of only the underserved or the poor. It's an issue that every woman continues to suffer from, including myself. And, I always talk about when I was diagnosed with cancer, how lucky I am to have been able to advocate for myself, because I have the ability to do my own research and the social network to find people and get advice and thoughts and to consult. And I think if I didn't have that, I would have been so lost in the system. And I'm not sure my outcomes would have been what they were. You've been in this space for a long time. You worked at the Gates Foundation, the largest foundation investing in public health right now. From your perspective and from the years of working in a big foundation like that, is that enough? I mean, is it enough for a foundation what do we really need to change to level the playing field and to completely shift this entire field of healthcare that has been designed around the body of a white male?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I don't think any one institution can solve the problem on their own. What I think the benefit of the Gates Foundation is that it can take risks that governments could ideally scale, governments and other partners. I will say on women's health specifically, and this is a little bit married to your last question on economic opportunity and leadership, for me, women's health is, I think, the starting point.
Yeah.
It's really challenging for me to go up to a young woman and say, hey, you need to be a political or an economic leader.
Yeah.
If she doesn't have agency over her own choices, her own body, she doesn't have the access to health and care, I think that's the gateway to opportunity in my mind. And so for me, health really does become
the cornerstone.
The cornerstone, right? And to your point, when you have access to care, when you can be your own advocate. Imagine if you didn't have those systems at all. Imagine if you didn't have those resources at all. Not that you didn't know them, but that they just didn't exist where you were. And so the fact that a young woman can that the trajectory of your life is completely shifted based on where you're born, because of what it means for your access to care, and for your access to opportunity is something that I think is just incredibly unjust. And so a huge amount of my
especially in 2024.
Especially in 2024. And I mean, you can point to specific things. The fact that we still have women dying in childbirth, to me, is absolutely,
and I heard your last when you spoke about that.
Yeah, we have solutions that cost less than $2, that cost less than $1. Literally plastic drapes that can help save not just the mom, but the baby, the family, the community. So to me, that one is really stark. But I think for both economic empowerment, economic opportunity and leadership, and for women's health, one thing we don't talk about enough is power. And women are not often the ones making a lot of the decisions, right? And so if you're looking at, for example, the investment in global health R&D that goes to kind of women-specific issues, it's less than 4%. And if you take out cancer, it's less than 2%. And that's pretty shocking because women have a lot of women-specific issues that actually mean quite a bit for their productivity,
and even within that
for their
cancer,
prosperity.
Most of it goes to a very specific cancer.
Exactly.
And the rest of the women's cancers get the shorter end of the stick.
Exactly, 100%. And so I think part of it is, okay, who is sitting in decision-making spaces that we can advocate to, I think is critically important. That's one area where the foundation really takes a leading approach. But then also, how do we get more women in those positions that are making decisions around those resource pools? Because I do think the more funding we can get into women's health research, actually the more cost-effective the tools will be, so they won't be so high cost, so they can get to more women. We can create better delivery systems and access systems. So I do think part of it's not just a one-size-fits-all. It won't be a one organization fits all. But what we have been able to do in the past 3 years is actually get people talking about it, recognizing that women's health is critical, recognizing that healthy women build healthy communities. And that's true based on every economic metric. And I don't think we are globally in such a positive economic landscape that we can ignore that large of a labor force. And so I'm pretty pragmatic. I don't care what language I have to use. I will talk about women as, economic representative agents. I will talk about them in terms of productivity. I'll use entrepreneurship language. It genuinely does not matter to me if the end outcome is more resources and more policies that benefit women's health and women's opportunity. I think we should advocate to everybody because there's a lot of positions of power that just aren't part of the conversation.
And so many things would change if women were at that table making those decisions. So you recently launched a newsletter called Radical Resilience. I encourage everyone to subscribe. And it emphasizes that resilience isn't passive. You say it demands intention, collaboration, and action. From women in Senegal to systemic transformations in Bangladesh, you describe radical as going to the root of a problem and resilience as more than just surviving. It's about fundamentally reshaping and reimagining systems. Resilience is a word that I think we often throw around very casually. And we always, say to our entrepreneurs, part of being an entrepreneur, especially in an emerging market or a growth market, is being resilient. And I think, you reading your newsletter, it opened my eyes up because when we say resilience, we do mean survival. And you've put it into something that is, I think, much more profound and bigger, which is connecting that to being able to reshape systems. So what was the catalyst for starting this newsletter?
I think my catalyst was community. Before COVID, I had invested in and really spent so much time and energy in community with other leaders, other emerging leaders, predominantly women from the Global South. And we had something called the Emerging Leaders Lab. We spent 2 days together. We became very, very good friends and have been a sustaining community to each other for the past few years. And I often get asked by young women, okay, but how do you do it? I have 2 young kids, like, oh, how do you balance? I don't. I optimize. There are true things, right? And who do you look to? And I say, well, who are your role models? And I'm like, well, mostly the women I work with, the women I get to see, in not necessarily in the same field as me, but leading in their own fields. And when I had to think about what I would kind of collectively define them as, it was resilient. They are all people who withstood incredible change in their community. Oftentimes were the ones driving much of that change, at huge personal risk. And it didn't mean that they weren't committed. It meant that they were even more so, and that it was because of their faith in the power and potential of their own community and country that they were so determined to do it. So I found that particularly important, and so many of them went through a personal experience that drove that, something that otherwise could have been completely something that in many people I don't think would have inspired that kind of resilience. And instead they took it and they said, okay, how can I build from this? How can I change this so it never happens to anybody else? And then for radical, I thought it was interesting because I get called radical, usually not in the most positive way all the time. And so
I get that. We all get that.
Yeah, truly. And so
we understand.
Exactly.
Donovan's back there. He gets it too.
No, truly, but like literally. So weeks and months before we were naming this, I was reading this book and it was talking about how radical was just kind of to go to the root of it. I'm like, that's not how we use it anymore. And I think we should re-own that word. I think it's actually a very powerful one. And so the more we can say, it's actually incredibly radical to demand change. It's incredibly radical to then build it, to build resilient systems, to, there's other terms people use like anti-fragility, and to me, it's less about the, everybody should use the term they're comfortable with, but I like resilience because it actually, you get to a point where it is oftentimes fragile. That's a very human experience at a community level, at a personal level. I think it's great for us to be able to build armor. But oftentimes that armor fails. And in many of our circumstances, it's not necessarily choices of ours, but it's the systems and structures around us. And so you do have to build resilience. And I think it's
the way to keep going.
Yeah, incredibly powerful lessons we've learned, not necessarily from me, but from so many people around me that have kept me sustained. And so that was really kind of the impetus of the newsletter, is how do I, and I intentionally did it on LinkedIn because I was like, I can either use this platform for updates, and when I do a panel, or I can actually use this to say, I learned from some really incredible, particularly women, and I'd love for you to meet them. And that's what we ended up doing.
But do continue to share your panels, because that's how I get your, that's how I get to follow you. You're entering into perhaps a new chapter, I think, in your career. And I know you've been talking to me a lot about this intersection between health and climate, and, how you want to start pushing more in that direction. But what I've found really interesting lately is that you've been talking about the importance of capital allocation and investing in applying a gender lens investment approach, and really looking into investing in entrepreneurs who are in the climate space and in the health space. That's a massive shift. So what made you decide to say, you know what, risk capital, venture capital, and how capital is allocated is also an extremely important piece of this puzzle? And I always say this a lot too. I say, for the past several years, I've always been focused on venture capital as the very beginning of a venture's journey. And beginnings really matter to how things end.
Yep. I will say you are one of the people who has influenced my approach, and you know that. And my husband has influenced my approach significantly.
Yeah, Muhammad influences all of us.
I know, truly. But I think seeing... there were 2 things for me. The first is, in the past few years, we have seen the contraction of a lot of government funding.
Yeah.
And I realized just how malleable that is. And we also see a huge surge in private sector and philanthropic wealth that I think can drive pretty significant shifts. for the past 4 years, I served as the director at the Gates Foundation, and I realized how much you could leverage that to take risks and to be able to prove a case, right? And I think that's what we're missing. We don't invest the capital to even be able to say, look, this is a good buy. We've actually done this. We've tested that. It's great. We've done it in multiple countries. So where do you get that kind of risk capital? And that drove me more and more to thinking about, okay, what are those? And I don't think it's just funding. I think it has to be married with programs. I think it has to be married with really strong advocacy. But how do you more effectively actually invest in it to be able to prove, okay, this is actually what works in a much more intersectional way, a much more multisectoral way? So that, I think, was one of the major kind of pivot points. And the second was, I think there is a challenge in that sometimes we invest in programs from the global development perspective that can parachute in and out. Mm-hmm. And I find that local entrepreneurs prove to be more resilient in that sense. They stay, they build, they expand. Exactly.
They're invested in the community.
And they reinvest in the community. Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself ends up being such an incredible engine. And so for me, it was the question of, okay, and particularly women. Women, when they have economic agency, tend to reinvest much more in their community. Mm-hmm. And so how do we then look at women not as, okay, let's think about gender equitable policies on health or climate, but how do we instead look at them as these like central drivers of resilience and agency? How do we instead look at, okay, if I invested in entrepreneurship that had a particular focus on inclusivity, not just women, but really looked at, okay, this is the population I'm serving. This is how I can drive inclusive growth. And had impacts on your health and your climate outcomes. What would that mean in a sustainable sense? So I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. But I'm increasingly interested in the private sector role, and I have been. Years ago, I was the CEO of a company called Impact 2030 that worked with a lot of private sector companies, and I find it incredibly compelling as we see more and more companies say, okay, we're going to be more committed to these principles. How do we actually then leverage that at the very local level? And I do think that's oftentimes local entrepreneurs. So
maybe time for you to come work with us. I'm joking, but not joking. But the center at the very core of it is this belief that entrepreneurship and innovation is extremely critical to creating sustainable prosperity. And for years, global development has not included entrepreneurs in that process, specifically innovation-driven entrepreneurs who are using technology and R&D to solve complex challenges. And, entrepreneurs get taken seriously when they've reached that billion-dollar status. And we want to say, take them seriously from the beginning. Yep. Because they will be the ones who are transforming systems and doing that. So,
and it's that the innovation piece is particularly interesting because I think if we don't invest in local entrepreneurs who are driving innovation and making it more accessible, then you actually create an even bigger inequity, an economic inequity where people have access to innovation, people get to use it, and some don't. And I think that's also a risk. So it's also kind of it's sustainable and it's more equitable if we actually invest locally. And if we do it in a much more intentional way and we actually build opportunities and systems around it. And I wouldn't just say it's the venture capital, but it's also what kind of partnerships and relationships that do you then build with local and national governments or subnational governments to be able to ensure that then they create the necessary regulatory framework pathways or some of the necessary partnerships to ensure that those entrepreneurs can be successful.
Can leverage those other, there's a professor, his name is Hal Gregerson, and in his work he often talks about the compounded impact, the multiplier effect. And I think women entrepreneurs are not just important to invest and say, oh, we invested in women entrepreneurs, but they have such an incredible multiplier effect. And I love how you always bring that back into the conversation, in the sense that women will always reinvest what they have in their society, in their families, their surrounding communities, and you will see that multiplier effect always. I see it all the time. Even when we put technology and innovation-driven entrepreneurship aside, and we just look at small businesses run by women in the informal sector, the first thing that women do is educate their children.
Yep. Yep.
And that leads to a multiplier effect.
It's a consequence of the unpaid labor you were talking about.
100%.
Is that they then drive back any paid labor back into their communities, and they create greater economic opportunity for other women and men, which is, I think, incredibly
So
important.
how does this all funnel back into your passion of climate and health?
I think so. My husband years ago said, if you don't figure out what you want to do, other people will figure out what you can't do for them. And so he's always been very good at being, be very clear about what it is you want to do. I do, I travel a lot for work, and I used to say, even to my parents, like, it has to be something I really believe in for it to be worth being away from my own kids. And for me, that is that every woman and every child has access to opportunity. And I only think that's possible through access to care. I really do. I think if you do not have health care, the rest actually becomes a lot more challenging, if not, frankly, nearly impossible. And I think there are some key years there. For women, it's, their entire lifetime, frankly. But those first 5 years for children are incredibly important. Critical. And I also think you then double the challenge, and you remember the floods last year in Libya. You double the challenge with these climate events and with the shifting climate that is going to be catastrophic in many of our countries, and is going to create completely new challenges that I don't think we have the infrastructure or the resources often to be able to face. But we do have the talent, we have the people, we have the innovation, we have the appetite. So I do think. We've spoken a little bit about this, but I think the next step has to be something that really looks at people as they experience life, not kind of the vertical way we approach it of like, oh, health here, climate here.
Intersected.
Intersected. For a woman who actually works in community, be her a smallholder farmer or a community health worker, the same woman is the one trying to feed and educate her kids. She's the same woman who's trying to potentially start a venture, open a bank account. The same woman, genuinely the same woman who is working those smallholder farms, is the same one who's trying to get access to care. And until we
will be the same woman who has to deal with the aftermath of a flood.
Exactly, the exact same one. And so I think if we start anchoring that experience as the starting point, we can actually start building solutions that then reflect those lived experiences and what's needed. And I do think elements of it will need to be resourcing much more directly, investing in women. I do think there is a piece that's not necessarily building an evidence base, but almost taking all of the data that exists, because there is quite a bit.
So much.
And being able and leveraging it for advocacy, making it more digestible. And then I do think there's a piece that is working with government and with institutions to say, okay, what are the policies that you have in place now? How can we make them more effective? Working with existing funds and saying, okay, how can we ensure that we're actually taking a much more inclusive approach to our investments? And then leveraging health and climate outcomes as proof and evidence, not just the economic outcomes, but proof and evidence of the impact. But my thinking is in its infancy, as you know. And a lot of this is still, please send me all your books and reading and everything that I should be doing to better interrogate
Yes,
it.
we love it when people get interested in venture capital and entrepreneurship and innovation. That's just our preoccupation. But,
Well, I do like the ability, I like the idea of investing for impact.
Yeah.
I think that to me is incredibly compelling, and how we can do that in a way that truly shifts people's health outcomes, allows for communities to build resiliency to climate, allows for communities to really build robust systems of care. I'm really curious.
And I think the reality is, and I don't think very few venture capitalists realize this anywhere in the world, how you build your portfolio. You can build it in a way that can transform a system.
Yeah.
And that's a choice. And that goes back to some of the things you say about intentionality. And we just have to be more intentional about how we allocate capital, what we choose to do with our philanthropic investments, with our private, everything requires intentionality. Yeah. So I'm excited for what comes next for you. But I do want to ask you, so in my last podcast with Christopher Schroeder, he turned the table on me. In the middle of the podcast, because, you carry a gazillion hats and you play so many roles. I also, carry multiple hats, but I don't think, I think I have, minus the fact that I'm not a mother, but you are, and you have 2 little children, but yet you have all these other hats. You're also a wife, you're also a daughter, you're a sibling of 10 others, of 10 other kids. So we only have 24 hours a day. How do you balance all of your roles? And I'm sure that you, like all of us, get bombarded with emails and WhatsApps and LinkedIn messages. And what is your trick to managing all of these different things and creating? Is there balance? I know you said earlier there's no such thing as balance. There's optimization.
Well, I don't know if it's so. First off, I actually want to hear your answer to that question because I think you get bombarded with way more messages than me.
Not so sure. Not so sure.
I tend to, my first lesson is ignore WhatsApp. No, that's awful. But
I know that you do that.
I do.
Because you answer me quite late.
I have, yeah. I do. Well, what happens is actually, it's not even that I answer. I'll read something, and in my mind, I've responded to you, and then I usually reopen the message when I want to come back and ask you why you haven't responded to me, and I'm like, oh wait, I didn't send that message.
We have another colleague who does that. It's a good strategy.
It's a great strategy. But I do have blackout periods where I just don't open messaging apps, and I will delete them from my phone, and I'll re-download them as needed. And that's more just because if I have had a long travel period, I'm home with the kids for 3 days, I actually want to be 100% home with the kids. But I don't balance. I used to be in like this relentless pursuit of balance where I was like, oh, when am I going to find it? And
it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. Well, I read this great book though that I have now used almost as has been incredible for me, which is kind of that you juggle balls in life, and some balls are glass and some balls are rubber. So your glass ball, if it falls, it breaks, and your rubber ball will bounce. And I used to think, okay, well, then all my glass balls must be family and all my rubber balls must be work. And it actually is so much more nuanced in that, like, let's say you have a really big work trip and you have to be on site for 3 days. That becomes your glass ball for 3 days. And my rubber ball for that 3 days is family. Mm-hmm. And if I come home and my kid is really sick, then that becomes my glass ball. Being home, putting them to, taking care of them, bedtime, and work is, in my work project or meeting or whatever it might be is a rubber ball. And so it's more of a, and it applies to everything. My dad, right now my dad is sick, and so that becomes a glass ball. And I'll say, okay, I have to drop other things. I'm gonna prioritize this. And in this exact moment, this podcast is the glass ball. So I won't pick up my phone and check on my kids. And I think that's been the easiest way I've kind of maybe consoled myself with
I love it.
all the rubber balls I drop.
Totally like glass ball, rubber ball.
Yeah,
I think it's brilliant.
I will juggle what is in that moment, what is the most critical,
right?
And I'll give myself grace that I only have 2 hands, so I'm not juggling the rest.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people in my family, my husband in particular, my kids, even though they're quite young and haven't realized it yet, my parents, but a lot of people give me grace because they know that I am trying to
no, that's
juggle.
True. Your daughter was here in our office earlier this week, and I said, "Where's mommy?" She said, "Dina, mommy's in Seattle working." She has to do work in Seattle. And we get to come here and play. Yeah. And I was like, look at this child. She's 4 years old supporting her mama.
No, she does. Mashallah, they're amazing. They'll, even when I'm getting sad that I have to go for a long trip, Sidine will be like, but mama, it's okay. You're helping people live lives. And I'm like, oh, okay, I like that.
Yeah.
But of course they like coming here. You give them chocolate and you let them just color.
I did not give them chocolate last time.
They found chocolate. But they love it here every single time. I'm like, did you see Auntie Dina? She's like, yeah, I had some chocolate. I had some candy.
Yeah, no, there was no candy last time. There was no chocolate, ice cream, candy, none of that. Auntie Dina gave them none. So none at all.
False. I don't think they see you without getting something
No, they don't.
Sweet.
They see me as exactly. That's right. It's okay. We genuinely did not give them anything last time. But anyway. Donovan and I both want to ask you about hope. And earlier this year, you gave a toast at the Times 100 Impact Dinner. And something you said stood out specifically to Donovan, and he wanted me to ask you. You said, "I'm immensely grateful in a deeply bittersweet way and inspired by the courage and dedication of health workers in conflict zones." You also worked in an area of conflict, and today you're consistently at the forefront of these very difficult conversations about gender inequity, food insecurity, and climate change in areas of conflict. But somehow it still seems like joy and gratitude are deeply at your core. I want to say that is connected to your deep faith in spirituality, but the question still remains, how do you stay so hopeful even after everything that you've seen and still see around the difficulties of today's world?
It's a good question, Donovan. Oof. It's been a long couple of months, so you asking me this one it's been a year. I remain hopeful. I don't think I have the privilege of not being hopeful.
Yeah.
I think when I say like frontline healthcare workers is bittersweet because I am so grateful they are there for their communities, but it's so bitter that they have to be, that they are in that position in the first place, and that we have global systems that perpetuate those inequities and those conflicts. I don't think I have the privilege of being unhopeful. I am incredibly privileged. I have had the benefit of two parents who were absolutely driven for my success. My grandmother was illiterate, never had an education, determined her daughter would. My mom was married at 15, and I was able to make my own choices. My life is a consequence of other people's action and hope. And so I don't think I have the privilege of it. I think I'm accountable. And a huge part of it is my faith. I am entirely accountable to use whatever gifts or talents or access or networks or experience or knowledge or whatever I have been blessed to be given, which is not a reflection of me, I genuinely don't think, but a reflection. And
it is a reflection of you,
but to advance something I think bigger than myself. So I really don't think we have the privilege to be unhopeful. I think, and it was interesting these past couple of weeks in particular in the US, a lot of conversations around like, oh, what do we do? I'm like, people have been at the forefront of change and action in situations that are so much more challenging than any you're imagining. They have, there are people in countries who have been taking on life and death there, to make change. And so I actually think we all have a huge privilege by nature of where we are, where we're born. So that's probably where I get hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very fair. So since this podcast is called Legacy of Purpose, and I consider you somebody who's extremely purpose-driven, and I think everything you've said up until this point demonstrates just how purposeful you are. The last question I have is about legacy. And, you have two beautiful children that I love. I'm always excited to see them. You have a wide network of friends and family and all the people that you serve. But when you leave this earth, as we all will, how do you want to be remembered? And what is the legacy you want to leave behind?
Oh, what's the legacy you want to leave behind?
I can answer that question after the podcast.
Why not on the podcast? I don't know if I have that answer for you, Dina. I mean, I would want to be somebody who did everything they could to ensure that all moms and babies could survive, could live healthy and effective lives. But I think that's kind of a mission I have for myself. A legacy is probably that I spent what time I could trying to build something better for others. I don't know that I was a good mom, whatever that looks like. I don't know. I haven't answered that yet. I'll spend the next 5 or 10 years figuring out what that should be. But I think right now my legacy, my purpose for life, whether it ends up being a legacy to anybody else or not, is that I did everything I could to make sure other people could have healthy and prosperous lives.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that'll amount to a legacy, but it amounts to a mission for me.
I think it's always those of us who are constantly evolving, and I think some people just naturally are always in this evolutionary mindset and who are always pushing. You reach one mountain, you're like, where's the next mountain, and where's the next thing that I get to climb? And you're very much that person, and probably I am to an extent too. And I think when we talk about legacy, it is important because we're here in this world for such a short time. And we take that for granted. I think somehow we think we're going to be here forever, but actually you're here like for nothing.
Yeah, but I think the coolest legacy is then like not what, but who do you leave behind? You know what I mean? Like how, if
Or
I've done
who
this,
you've touched.
exactly. Like if I've done this right, there will be entire families, communities, and not like if we've done this right, if we've genuinely said we're going to anchor women's health and we're going to ensure that we invest in climate resilience and we're going to ensure that, you know, a girl can choose when she wants to get married, and we're going to make sure that people have access to education regardless of where they're born. And if we've genuinely done that right, then there are entire families and communities and that will exist and that will be able to build out their own opportunities. And you'll have, you know, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of leaders, and there will be but I don't know if that amounts to my legacy. I think that's something I would love to see happen in partnership with everybody else who needs to help make it happen. And then when I very selfishly think of what would my legacy be, honestly, my brain goes to my kids, and it goes to like, I really just want to be a good mom. So no, I don't know. What's your legacy, Dina?
You're not letting that go.
I'm not.
Yeah. Like I said, I think for me, I've thought a lot about it, right? I don't have children. I'm not married, but I think whether we call it legacy or, you know, what you want to have left behind when you pass on from this part of our journey on this earth, I think if I can continue to create spaces that allow all the different people in my life to thrive and reach their full potential, then that would have been a life well lived. And whether that shows up in me, you know, pushing Donovan to do better, or me standing by a friend in a difficult time, or me creating spaces like what we have here at the Center for entrepreneurs to find their way and to create communities that will make the world a better place, it shows up in many different ways. But I think for me, it's all about creating space for those around me, those I care about, those I love, to reach their fullest potential.
I think you do that for more than just the people you love. And I think beyond that, you also invest heavily in them, with time, with energy. I mean, the work that you do on entrepreneurship with resources. But I mean, I think aside from the center being a testament, literally your entire life is a testament to the fact that you don't occupy a space without opening a door for others. And you in fact, I think, open doors for others before you ever even enter them for yourself. So
well, I appreciate you saying that.
Well on the way to fulfilling.
I appreciate you saying that. I don't know what it is with podcast guests reversing the podcast on me. Anyway, I want to thank you so much, Alaa, for joining us on this episode of A Legacy of Purpose, and I can't wait for this to be aired. I think conversations like this one really remind me of the incredible importance of what values-based leadership really is, and how you embody that, and how you show up in your work, and how you show up as a mom, and how you show up as a friend, and how you show up as a visionary fighting for women. And I think that the impact that you have had and that you will continue to have in this world is something that I'm deeply grateful for. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe and share it with others. And you can find out more about episodes on Spotify or on Apple, or you can just come to our Legatum Center website or YouTube channel. Thank you again for listening, and looking forward to the next episode soon to be out.
Thank you for having me, Dina.
Thank you, Alaa.
Thank you.